Aon and CyberCube have recently worked together to create a joint report looking at the impact of COVID-19 and working from home practices and what this means for cybersecurity. I'm Yvette Essen for CyberCube, and I'm joined by Jon Laux, Head of Cyber Analytics Reinsurance Solutions for Aon, and Darren Thomson, Head of Cybersecurity Strategy for CyberCube. Perhaps I could start with you, Jon. First of all, can you describe the state of the market for cyber reinsurance even prior to coronavirus? Before it hit, what was the market like then?
Thanks, Yvette. I would say if you had to characterize the cyber market really over the last 18 months, it has really been the story of ransomware. Not that ransomware was new 18 months ago. It's been around for several years now. But over 2019 and into 2020, I think we've seen happen what we, to some extent, feared would happen, which is that ransomware has really escalated in terms of primarily the frequency, but also the severity of ransomware attacks. Just to give you some sense for that and the data that we track, if you look at the fourth quarter of 2019 relative to the prior fourth quarter, ransomware attacks were up about 3 times or more what we had seen previously. And that trend continued at least through the end of the first quarter of 2020 as well. We're still pulling our Q2 numbers. And so that's a pretty significant change. In the data that we analyzed for the full year of 2019, the industry loss ratio went up about 10 loss ratio points, at least in the US. And so, coming into 2020, insurers were grappling with what do we do about that? And so while 2019 was largely the story of starting to just become aware and looking for ways to mitigate that attack, we've started to see that translate into market conditions changing. And so insurers have been taking stock of their capacity deployment, their attachment point, and probably most importantly, their rates. We've seen pretty significant hard market conditions thus far during the year. Rates increasing 5 to 15% is what we've heard from our retail colleagues at Aon. And so when COVID-19 entered the mix, it really has been fuel on that fire, if you will, in the sense of accelerating some of that concern and caution on the part of insurers as they've been responding to some of the impact to the asset side of their balance sheet, as well as some of the additional risk that they're feeling on the liability side as well.
Darren, I'd like to turn to you now and ask you to explain to me a little bit about what is happening now. So with regards to people working increasingly from home, what kind of implications does this create for companies? What types of risks are being created?
So first of all, Yvette, to echo what Jon was saying, we already had a pretty active threat landscape before the pandemic, ransomware being really the vanguard of that, what most people are concerned about. Interestingly, very soon after kind of lockdown and the COVID sort of global nature of that pandemic, we did see an uptick in pretty much every category of security risks. So across, spam, phishing, etc., general malware, there was about a 30% year-on-year increase there. We would normally expect 15-ish%. So clearly, the pandemic was having an effect. I think part of that was because actually non-cyber criminals are starting to become cyber criminals. They were locked down as well, and so they're finding other avenues for their criminal activity. To get to the home working thing, obviously, end of February, beginning of March, everybody became locked down. We started to see a couple of things really. First of all, cloud applications that became the new norm for home working. Applications like Zoom, for example, started to be stress tested, and so certain security vulnerabilities were uncovered. They probably would have been uncovered eventually anyway, but an extra few million users will do that to an application. I personally think there's a plus and a minus there. Short term that was bad, people got scared. Those applications over time though will become better and more robust applications because they've been stressed. We also saw, though, criminals started to take advantage at a tactical level of some of the exposures that you see with home working. So, poor passwords probably being the most important domain there, and not just passwords on end user devices, but passwords on network routers, for example. Whilst we're relying on network routers in our offices that are probably maintained by an IT organization, suddenly we're relying on routers that we set up ourselves and probably never altered the passwords or security configurations on. So there are implications there. Other implications, such as what happens when a laptop goes wrong. The remote desktop protocol that Microsoft enabled, allowing, for example, systems administrators to remotely log onto our systems, that becomes a great attack vector for a criminal. Lack of patching on Microsoft operating systems starts to become, even more of a problem than it normally is, because less patching was happening at home. So there are all kinds of tactical, technical implications to home working, which we're still working through now.
Jon, building on some of the points that Darren has outlined, could you perhaps highlight what these changes in working practices have meant for the insurance sector?
Yeah, Vet, I think the single biggest change, as Darren said, many companies, including ours, we've been transitioning to the work from home era, if you will, however long this goes on. And in that environment, hastily deployed or misconfigured virtual networking tools really are what are going to pose the biggest threat to firms. Really, as Darren said, if a company is spinning up more servers to support VPN connections, for example, that always requires care. But if you have to do it quickly, the potential for mistakes is just going to go up. We just recently saw a vulnerability that was disclosed about Palo Alto Networks. We've seen Pulse Secure in the past. So, as Darren said, the environment's being stress tested right now, and we're seeing more of those things. So that's probably the principal one that I think a lot of organizations are facing. A few of the others that I would comment on. The first, from our conversations with the incident response teams at Aon, one of the challenges that can happen when an event does occur is this is more on the severity side, but the process of resolving an incident can just take longer. If you can imagine, again, say an endpoint gets infected by ransomware, and that endpoint is an employee's laptop sitting in their home. Now you have to ship that laptop somewhere to get it resolved and remediated. So that can slow some of the process down. Equally, if a company's trying to roll out new endpoint protection products, for example, that can be a little bit more arduous than in an office working environment. So those are some of the things that can also become a little bit more logistically challenging, and in some cases maybe add to the cost of remediating cyber incidents as well. There's the threat environment at large, and then there's how that translates into potential insurance claims. If we use the cyber kill chain as a framework, and so the start of the kill chain and the end of the kill chain are not the same thing. And so I think a lot of the news and the general press in the current environment has really been about things at the start of the kill chain. Attacks have gone up. Again, maybe there's some additional vulnerabilities that companies have, but principally, and Darren underlined this, some of the key trends that we see that are really driving cyber claims really haven't changed that much. Remote desktop protocol exploits are really key, particularly for ransomware, and then phishing is still a thing, right? And that has not changed. If anything, at least back in March when the pandemic was more new, COVID-19 was the new phishing lure that threat actors were using. I think we're all a little tired of talking about the pandemic in certain respects, so maybe that doesn't work quite as well for the threat actors at the moment. But if it's working, to keep doing it, and that's broadly what we've seen in terms of how the actual successful claims have been carried out.
Thanks for highlighting some of those issues, Jon, but perhaps you could explain to me a little bit about what Aon cybersecurity experts are suggesting that organizations should be doing to improve their cybersecurity.
Many organizations are in this work environment transition, and so I think what's called for is to refocus cybersecurity controls really to be more responsive to the needs of users. And so that means focusing on new remote access vectors. That could be endpoints, whether it's laptops or bring your own device policies, remote applications, or some of the cloud technology platforms that Darren mentioned earlier, that people are using on a day-to-day basis to do their jobs. It's not complicated, but it's not easy. we know what to do. It's just hard, right? So when we're working in a more decentralized and remote work environment, we're still trying to deploy reasonable security controls, as best we can, but it just proves a little bit more challenging. I will say this: I think any organization that, again, maybe back in March, had rapidly been forced to roll out new technologies or applications or services to make the remote work environment possible, what they really should be doing at this point, if they're not already, is taking a look back at what they've done thus far to ensure that they are following best practices as far as security configuration and architecture goes. Many of the organizations that Aon works with have been finding that, in that era of rapid deployments, it was necessary at the time, but that there were security vulnerabilities that were introduced in the process. So this is really a time to go back and kind of harden the perimeter as best one can, because it seems like this is a situation we're going to be dealing with for a while. So, now's the time to make sure that you're doing everything you can to make sure your environment's secure.
Finally, Darren, can we look a bit forward? What are the new norms we expect to see in IT security subsequent to the pandemic?
Well, I think there will be new norms in terms of IT usage, security behaviors, vulnerabilities, and some of the things that we've spoken about. At the individual level, I think we can safely assume that more people globally are going to be working from home than ever before subsequent to the pandemic. People that did not believe that it was possible for them to work from home have found it is possible. Organizations are finding productivity levels in many cases have actually gone up. And so I think we can expect this to continue, and again, governance and best practices need to be revised as a result. I think secondly, at the individual level, people are going to get used to certain freedoms. So, for example, in cloud computing and use of cloud applications, for a decade now, organizations have struggled with the push and pull of extra productivity and flexibility that cloud brings against, trying to govern that in some way and mitigate some of the risks, particularly around data in the cloud, the cloud brings. And so I think we're likely to see a dynamic of users wanting freedom of choice in terms of cloud applications, and the business needing to mitigate those risks in some way and as much as possible control that kind of innovation. I think we can also expect the new business and small business sector to struggle initially here. It is a case that, for organizations of less than, let's say, 200 employees, typically don't have a security organization. They may have an IT organization and security might be part of their remit. I think it's going to be tough for those organizations coming out of the pandemic for economic reasons and others. And so unfortunately, I think, small businesses are likely to go back a couple of steps in terms of security, and that is something that I would predict that cyber criminals are likely to take advantage of.
Jon, Darren, thank you very much for your time. A copy of that report, Pandemic Under the Microscope, can be found on CyberCube's website, cybercube.com. For CyberCube, I'm Yvette Essen.